name is Eric. I was 21 years old when this happened, and I was studying business administration at a community college in central Illinois. To help pay for tuition and the rent on a small apartment, I worked the night shift at a movie theater located in a relatively small town in the area. At that time, my routine was practically the same every day. I attended classes in the morning, studied during the afternoon, and worked until late at night. Since I didn't own a car, I depended entirely on public transportation to get to and from work. That normally wasn't a problem because the town was quiet and the buses operated reasonably reliably. What happened to me took place on a night in November 2021. I had just finished a particularly long shift after the premiere of a highly anticipated movie. The theater closed later than usual, and I had to rush to catch the last bus of the night. If I missed it, I would have had to walk nearly an hour back to my apartment. I was tired, cold, and just wanted to get home and sleep. When I boarded, the bus still had a few passengers scattered throughout the seats. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There was an older woman near the front, two teenagers sitting together a few rows back, and a man sitting alone near the rear of the vehicle. I chose a seat near the middle and put on my headphones, although the music was so low that I could still hear the engine and the conversations around me. The ride began normally. At each stop, a few people got off. As we moved through the more distant neighborhoods, the bus became increasingly empty. It was during this time that I started noticing the man seated in the back. There was nothing particularly strange about his appearance. He looked to be somewhere between 40 and 50 years old, wore a dark jacket and a simple cap. What caught my attention was the fact that he remained completely motionless. During the entire ride, I never saw him look out the window, use a phone, or adjust his position in the seat. He simply sat there staring toward the front of the bus. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the more passengers got off and the emptier the bus became, the more I found myself watching that man. After approximately 15 minutes of travel, only 3 passengers remained on the bus. Me, the man seated in the back, and a woman who got off 2 stops before mine. When she left, I noticed for the first time that the driver also seemed to have noticed the man in the last rows. At one point, he looked into the interior mirror of the vehicle and kept his gaze fixed in that direction for a few seconds. Maybe I'm interpreting that now based on what happened later, but I clearly remember that moment. From then on, it was just me, the driver, and that man. The atmosphere inside the bus changed completely. The sound of conversations had disappeared. All that remained was the constant noise of the engine and the faint creaking of the suspension whenever we passed over uneven sections of the road. I discreetly looked back a few times. The man remained in exactly the same position. He didn't look sleepy. He didn't look distracted. He simply sat there staring forward. When my stop finally approached, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not because I believed I was in danger, but because the entire situation had become uncomfortable for no apparent reason. I got up from my seat and walked toward the front door. While waiting for the bus to come to a complete stop, I glanced back one last time. The man was still sitting there. The door opened, and I stepped onto the sidewalk. The street was practically empty. It was a little after midnight, and almost every business was already closed. My walk to the apartment normally took about 7 minutes. I started down the sidewalk with my hands in my pockets because of the cold. Some storefront windows reflected the streetlights, and it was in one of those reflections that I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the reflection of a closed shop window, I saw a figure walking behind me. I looked directly over my shoulder and immediately confirmed who it was. The man from the bus had also gotten off. The problem was that this wasn't a common stop for most people. The area was primarily residential, and there was almost no activity at that hour. I tried to convince myself that he simply lived nearby, but as I continued walking, I noticed that he maintained almost the exact same distance behind me. He didn't speed up, he didn't slow down. He simply kept walking down the empty street in the same direction I was going. For the first few minutes, I tried to act normal. I didn't want to seem paranoid or create a situation based solely on a coincidence. After all, it was entirely possible that he actually lived in that part of town. Even so, I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. I crossed the street at one point. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps crossing the same crosswalk behind me. I turned onto another street that was part of the route to my apartment. When I quickly glanced over my shoulder, I saw that he had made the same turn. The man continued, showing no sign of urgency. He wasn't carrying bags. He wasn't talking on the phone. He didn't seem to be looking for an address. He was simply walking. The distance between us remained practically unchanged. My heart truly started racing at that point. The streets were completely empty. No cars passed by. No houses had anyone visible outside. The cold felt more intense now, although that was probably just the adrenaline kicking in. I pulled out my phone and pretended to check messages while discreetly watching his reflection in a window. He was still there, still following me down the sidewalk. When I finally spotted the building where I lived, I felt a brief sense of relief. It was a small 3-story building with only a few apartments. I rented a unit on the 2nd floor. The plan was simple: get inside quickly, lock the main door behind me, and forget the entire situation. But as soon as I approached the entrance, I noticed something that immediately replaced that relief with another wave of discomfort. The main door was slightly open. That never happened. The building had an electronic lock and normally stayed closed at all times. I stopped for a moment, staring at the dark gap between the door and the frame. I thought about calling the landlord or one of the neighbors, but at that moment, all I wanted was to get inside and off the street. I looked back. The man was still walking toward me along the sidewalk. Without thinking much about it, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hallway was quiet and dimly lit. I closed the door behind me and started climbing the stairs toward the 2nd floor. That was when I heard another sound inside the building. Footsteps. They weren't coming from the street. They weren't coming from outside. They were coming from the staircase directly below me, as if someone had entered right after I came through the door. I immediately stopped halfway up the stairs and stood still, trying to listen more carefully. The building was old, and the wooden steps usually creaked whenever someone went up or down. I knew those sounds very well because I had lived there for nearly 2 years. The noise I heard didn't seem imaginary. Someone really was climbing the stairs. Slowly, step by step. My heart started pounding so hard that I could hear the pulse in my ears. I continued climbing, now more quickly, trying not to make much noise. When I reached the 2nd floor hallway, I quickly looked down through the opening in the staircase. I couldn't see anyone. The lighting on the ground floor was weak, and part of the structure blocked my view. Even so, the footsteps continued. I could hear them clearly. I pulled my keys from my pocket with hands that had already started trembling and hurried toward my apartment door. It took me longer than usual to find the correct key. The entire situation was making me nervous enough to make stupid mistakes. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I rushed inside and locked it behind me. I stood silently near the entrance for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath. The apartment was dark because I had left early that morning. I didn't turn on any lights immediately. My attention was completely focused on the hallway outside. The footsteps continued climbing for a few more moments. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I moved closer to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No person, no movement. I thought maybe a neighbor had arrived at the same time as me and simply gone into their apartment. That explanation seemed reasonable for a few seconds. Then I heard something different. A faint metallic sound coming from my door handle. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't someone calling out. It sounded more like someone carefully testing the lock. My entire body froze. The sound happened once, then again. Then the handle slowly turned until it reached the limit of the lock. Someone was trying to open the door without making noise. At that moment, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I tried to speak quietly so I wouldn't reveal exactly where I was inside the apartment, although today I realized that probably wouldn't have made any difference. While quickly explaining the situation to the dispatcher, I kept watching the door. The handle moved once more. Then everything went silent. The dispatcher told me to remain inside the apartment and informed me that a patrol car was already on the way. The next few minutes felt much longer than they actually were. I stayed away from the entrance, holding my phone and listening for any sound that might come from the hallway. About 2 minutes later, I heard footsteps again. This time, they weren't going up or down the stairs. They seemed to be moving away down the hallway. Then I heard the building's main door open and close downstairs. Only then did I begin to believe that the person had left. Even so, I remained locked inside the apartment waiting for the police to arrive. I had absolutely no intention of checking who was outside on my own. When the officers arrived, they checked the area around the building and spoke with me for a few minutes. No one was found. There were also no cameras covering the main entrance at that time. Before leaving, one of the officers asked why I believed the person who tried to open my door was the man from the bus. I replied that I wasn't absolutely certain, and that was true. I never saw the face of the person in the hallway. The problem was what happened a few days later. I was returning from work during the afternoon when I recognized that bus driver in a convenience store near the theater. I casually mentioned what had happened. When I brought up the passenger sitting in the back, he replied with something that still makes me uncomfortable. According to him, that night I had been the last passenger to get off the bus. He remembered the trip because the bus had been nearly empty, and because the man I described had gotten off approximately 20 minutes earlier in a completely different neighborhood from mine. Maybe the driver was mistaken. Maybe he was confusing it with another night. I wish that were the case. But even today, when I think about that ride, I still remember the reflection in the storefront window showing someone walking behind me, and I still can't explain who climbed those stairs right after I entered the building. Story 2. My name is Kayla. I was 23 years old when this happened, and I worked the night shift at a small 24-hour diner located on the outskirts of Springfield, Illinois. At the time, I was trying to save money to go back to school, so I accepted practically any schedule that was available. The hardest shifts were the weekday overnight shifts, when almost no customers showed up and staffing was reduced to the absolute minimum. On some nights, I was completely alone during the last few hours before the morning shift change. That normally didn't bother me. The area was considered relatively safe, and I was already used to the routine of cleaning equipment, organizing inventory, and balancing registers while waiting for the few customers who appeared during the early morning hours. What happened took place on a Tuesday in October of 2022. The night was unusually quiet. Shortly after midnight, business practically disappeared. For nearly an entire hour, not a single customer entered the restaurant, and no vehicles came through the drive-thru. I was finishing some cleaning tasks in the kitchen while listening to low music on the restaurant's internal radio. At around 1:20 a.m., I heard the drive-thru alert indicating that a car had pulled up to the ordering speaker. That wasn't unusual. I took off my cleaning gloves and walked over to the ordering system. I gave the standard greeting and asked what the customer would like to order. No response came from the other side. I waited a few seconds and repeated the question. Still nothing. I thought perhaps the customer was looking for something in the car or talking to someone else. I waited again. The silence continued. After nearly a minute without any response, I informed them over the intercom that I would be ready to take their order whenever they were prepared. I continued watching the camera monitor. The image showed a dark-colored car stopped beside the ordering station. The camera quality was poor and the lighting in that area was limited. I couldn't clearly see who was inside the vehicle. What I found strange was that it remained completely motionless. No window rolled down. No interior light came on. Nothing happened. Even so, at that moment, I simply assumed it was someone who was indecisive or distracted. After a few minutes, I returned to the kitchen and resumed cleaning. The car continued appearing on the monitor, parked in exactly the same place. I occasionally glanced at the screen while organizing utensils near the food preparation area. It was during one of those moments that I heard a sound coming from the side of the building. At first, I thought it was an object being hit by the wind. Then the sound repeated itself. Tap, tap, tap. They were light, rhythmic knocks. They weren't coming from the drive-thru area. They seemed to be coming from the side kitchen window, a narrow window facing a dark area beside the restaurant. I froze for a few seconds, trying to confirm what I had heard. The sound happened again. This time it was closer and clearer. Out of instinct, I walked to the window and pulled back part of the blind covering the glass. What I saw immediately made my stomach drop. There was a man standing outside. He was close enough that I could clearly see his face in the light coming from the kitchen. He didn't look like a customer trying to get someone's attention. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gesturing. He was simply standing there, staring directly into the restaurant. My first instinct was to step away from the window. The man remained motionless as I backed away. I remember immediately feeling that something was wrong. Normal customers enter through the front door or use the drive-thru. They don't walk up to a dark side window to watch employees during the middle of the night. I picked up the restaurant phone thinking about calling the manager, but then remembered that I was the only person in the building at that hour. That's when I decided to quickly check whether all the doors were locked. The main entrance was still properly secured. However, when I walked toward the back of the restaurant, I found something far more concerning. The rear door was closed, but the handle showed fresh marks. There were scratches on the metal near the lock mechanism and small fragments of chipped paint around the frame. It looked as though someone had attempted to force the door open using some kind of metal object. As I examined it, a cold sensation ran through my body. I rushed to the small window in the back door to check the parking lot. That's when I noticed another detail. The drive-thru car was still there. But now its headlights were completely off, and even from that distance I could tell that nobody seemed to be sitting in the driver's seat. I kept looking back and forth between the camera monitor and the back door window, trying to understand what was happening. The situation had stopped feeling strange and had started feeling dangerous. The man standing at the side window couldn't be inside the car at the same time. That meant at least one person had left the vehicle, and I had no idea where the other person might be. I grabbed my cell phone and began dialing the police while walking back toward the main area of the restaurant. Before the call even connected, I looked again at the drive-thru camera. The car was still parked there, but now one of the rear doors was open. I didn't remember seeing it open before. My heart started racing even faster. The image was too dark and grainy to show details, but I had the feeling that someone was standing near the vehicle, outside the range of the lighting. The emergency dispatcher finally answered, and I began explaining what was happening. While speaking, I kept my eyes fixed on the security monitors behind the counter. It was during that phone call that I heard another sound from outside. This time it wasn't light knocking. It sounded like someone trying to turn a doorknob. The noise came from the side door used for deliveries. I immediately looked at the corresponding camera and saw the silhouette of a person standing near the entrance. The image was partially obscured by darkness, but it was clearly someone standing beside the door. The figure tried the handle again, then stepped back a few feet and disappeared from view. I could feel adrenaline taking over my body. The dispatcher continued asking questions while I tried to monitor several cameras at once. Then something caught my attention on the drive-thru monitor. A second person briefly appeared beside the car. They emerged from the opposite side of the vehicle, looked toward the restaurant, and disappeared back into the darkness. That confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. It wasn't just the man at the window. There were at least two people moving around the restaurant during the middle of the night, and neither of them seemed interested in buying food. The emergency dispatcher instructed me to stay away from the doors and informed me that a patrol car was already on its way. I hid behind the kitchen preparation area, where I could still see the security monitors. The next few minutes were some of the longest of my life. The restaurant felt enormous when I was alone. Every sound from the ventilation system or the refrigerators made me immediately look toward the screens. At one point, I saw the man who had appeared at the side window again. This time, he slowly walked through a lit section near the drive-thru. I watched him for several seconds before he disappeared behind the building. What frightened me most wasn't his appearance. It was his behavior. He didn't seem rushed. He didn't seem nervous. He moved like someone who believed he had all the time in the world. A few moments later, the rear door of the drive-thru car closed. Shortly afterward, the vehicle began moving slowly. For the first time in nearly 20 minutes, the car left its spot. Instead of pulling up to the service window, however, it simply drove around the parking lot and disappeared onto the road without immediately turning on its headlights. About 3 minutes later, the red and blue lights of a police cruiser appeared reflected in the restaurant windows. I had never been so relieved to see a police car. The officers searched the entire building, the parking lot, and the surrounding area. No one was found. They also examined the rear door and confirmed that there were indeed fresh signs of an attempted break-in. Before leaving, they reviewed the security footage and recorded information about the vehicle. The problem was that the image quality wasn't good enough to identify the license plate. The following morning, when the manager arrived and watched the complete footage with me, we noticed something I hadn't realized during the night. The drive-thru car had never been completely empty. At various moments, it was possible to see someone sitting in the driver's seat while another person moved around outside the restaurant. To this day, we still don't know exactly what those people intended to do. Maybe they were looking for an opportunity to get inside. Maybe they were waiting for me to make a mistake and unlock one of the doors. What still bothers me is remembering the knocking on the window. Because when we reviewed the footage later, we discovered that the man had been standing there watching the kitchen for several minutes before finally getting my attention. During all that time, I was working alone without realizing that someone was standing outside, watching me through the glass. Story 3. My name is Brian. I'm 29 years old and work as a software developer for a company based in Chicago, although at the time I worked completely remotely from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Like many developers, I tended to keep strange hours. I often worked late into the night because I enjoyed the silence after the city slowed down. This happened in the winter of 2022. I lived alone in an old apartment building in downtown Milwaukee, probably built in the 1920s or 1930s. The building had a lot of charm, but it also came with all the typical problems of old construction: noisy plumbing, slow elevators, and floors that constantly creaked. Even so, I liked the place. My apartment was on the second-to-last floor. Above me, there was only one final floor that had been completely emptied for a planned renovation by the owner. I knew this because I had spoken with the building manager several times. All of the apartments on that floor had been vacant for months. The renovation hadn't even officially started yet. Because of that, there was practically no reason for anyone to be up there in the middle of the night. That night, I was finishing an important task for work. It was already past 3 in the morning when I began hearing a sound coming from the ceiling. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Old buildings make noises all the time, but after a few minutes, I realized that it didn't sound like a normal structural noise. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sound was long, irregular, and clearly caused by movement. Imagine the noise of a bookshelf or cabinet being slowly pushed across a wooden floor. It sounded exactly like that. I stopped typing and listened. The noise continued for several seconds before stopping. Then it started again. The sequence repeated 3 or 4 times. My first reaction was to think that a worker had entered the floor to get a head start on part of the renovation. But that didn't make sense. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday. Besides, I hadn't heard anyone enter the building or use the elevator. I kept listening for several minutes and the noise continued at irregular intervals. The more I listened, the more convinced I became that someone was actually moving objects directly above my head. After almost 15 minutes of trying to ignore the sound, my concentration was completely gone. The noise was constant enough to be irritating, but also strange enough to spark my curiosity. I picked up my phone and considered sending a message to the building manager, but I looked at the time and immediately gave up on the idea. Instead, I decided to go upstairs and check for myself. Not because I believed something dangerous was happening. In fact, I expected to find a maintenance worker operating outside normal hours. I left my apartment, crossed the empty hallway, and climbed the final flight of stairs to the floor above. As soon as I arrived, I noticed something strange. The hallway lights were off. That wasn't unusual because part of the power on that floor had been disconnected during the renovation period. I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the way. The hallway was long, narrow, and lined with closed doors from the former apartments. The silence up there was almost absolute. No sound of furniture being dragged. No conversation. No sign of workers. I stood still for several seconds listening. Then I heard the noise again. This time it seemed to be coming from one of the apartments at the far end of the hallway. I walked toward the sound and stopped in front of the corresponding door. The apartment number was still attached to the wall, although part of the paint around it had already been removed for renovation work. What immediately caught my attention was that the door was unlocked. It wasn't open, just slightly ajar. I pushed it gently and it moved without resistance. The first thing I did was call out to see if anyone was there. No response came from inside. I stepped only a few feet into the apartment and illuminated the interior with my phone. The apartment looked exactly how I expected a vacant unit awaiting renovation to look. There was no furniture, no decoration. Part of the carpet had already been removed and some walls showed areas where the paint had been scraped away. The smell was a mixture of dust, old wood, and construction materials. The strangest thing was that there was nothing inside capable of producing the heavy sound I had been hearing for so many minutes. I continued moving slowly through the rooms, trying to identify the source of the noise. That's when I heard something behind me. The apartment's front door slammed shut with enough force to echo throughout the empty space. The sound was so sudden that I practically jumped. My first reaction was to spin around and point the flashlight in that direction. The door was closed. I stood motionless for several seconds, trying to process what had happened. The most logical explanation was a draft. Old buildings often have poorly sealed windows, and differences in air pressure can cause doors to slam unexpectedly. That's exactly what I tried telling myself. The problem was that before I could even finish that thought, I heard another sound: footsteps. They weren't coming from inside the apartment. They were coming from the hallway outside, and they were running. Not slow footsteps, not the sound of someone walking normally. It sounded like a person moving down the hallway at full speed. The noise started near the entrance and quickly traveled toward the opposite end of the floor. My heart immediately began racing. I stood perfectly still and listened. The footsteps continued for several seconds before disappearing completely. The silence returned as abruptly as it had been interrupted. At that moment, I was certain of one thing. There was someone else on that floor besides me. I quickly walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. The beam from my phone illuminated only a small portion of the corridor, leaving the rest submerged in darkness. I looked one way, then the other. No one was visible. Even so, I still had that uncomfortable feeling that someone was watching me. I remained there for several seconds, trying to hear any movement. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen when I first came upstairs. One of the doors farther down the hallway was open. I was almost certain it had been closed only a few minutes earlier. The opening was small, maybe only a few inches, but noticeable from a distance. I stared at the door while trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to immediately return to my apartment and forget the entire situation. Another part wanted to find out who was making noises on an empty floor. While I hesitated, I heard a faint creaking sound from that exact direction. It wasn't a voice or someone calling out. It was the sound of weight being moved across a wooden floor. The same sound that had made me come upstairs in the first place. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward the partially open door. Today, I recognize that I should have simply left at that moment, but the situation still seemed explainable. I remained convinced that I would find either a trespasser using the vacant apartments, or perhaps someone connected to the renovation who wasn't supposed to be there at that hour. As I moved down the hallway, the floor creaked beneath my feet, and the flashlight beam swept across peeling walls and the closed doors of the other apartments. When I reached the open unit, I slowly pushed the door farther open. The apartment was very similar to the first one, empty, dusty, and partially prepared for renovation. The difference was that there were fresh marks on the floor. Several wooden boards had been scratched as though something heavy had been dragged repeatedly from one room to another. The marks looked new. They weren't covered by the same layer of dust as the rest of the floor. While I was examining them, I heard a sharp sound from somewhere behind me. I quickly turned the flashlight toward the hallway. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw movement near the far end of the floor. I couldn't clearly make out a person, only a shadow disappearing beyond the reach of the light. That was enough to convince me that I needed to leave immediately. I turned around and started walking back toward the stairwell. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were much closer. The sound came from the hallway behind me and seemed to follow my movement. It wasn't someone running directly toward me. It was more like someone moving between the apartments, maintaining a certain distance while staying in the same corridor. Adrenaline immediately took over. I stopped for a second to listen. The footsteps stopped too. I started walking again. A few seconds later, they returned. That eliminated any doubt I still had about imagining things. I wasn't alone on that floor. I increased my pace without actually running. When I finally saw the emergency stairwell door, I felt an enormous sense of relief. I reached the handle, pushed the door open, and practically ran down the stairs. I didn't stop until I reached the hallway on my own floor. Before entering my apartment, I looked upward through the stairwell opening. I didn't see anyone, but I clearly heard a door close on the floor above a few seconds after I left. I returned to my apartment, locked the door, and stayed awake for the rest of the night. I had no intention of doing any more work. I spent the following hours alternating between looking through the peephole and listening to sounds coming from the hallway. The sound of furniture being dragged never returned that night. I didn't hear any more footsteps either. Even so, the feeling of unease remained until sunrise. As soon as the management office opened, I called the building manager and told him everything that had happened. Initially, he seemed to believe that I had encountered a homeless person using the vacant apartments. But when I explained that the doors were supposed to be locked and mentioned the noises during the night, he decided to inspect the floor personally. Later that same day, he called me back. According to him, he found no one inside the apartments. There were also no obvious signs of forced entry. However, he confirmed something that made me uncomfortable. The apartment door where I first heard the noise was indeed supposed to be locked, and no maintenance personnel had authorization to work on that floor during that week. Over the following months, I continued living in the building, but I completely avoided the top floor. Sometime later, the renovation finally began, and workers started regularly moving around up there. One of them mentioned something interesting while we were talking in the elevator. According to him, several apartment doors would be found open in the mornings even after they had been locked the night before. Management always attributed it to careless workers or problems with the old locks. Maybe that was exactly what it was. Maybe the person I heard that night was simply someone using the vacant apartments without authorization. I wish the explanation were that simple. But there's one detail that still bothers me to this day. A few weeks after the incident, I requested access to footage from a security camera installed near the elevator on that floor. The building manager agreed to show me part of the footage from that night. The video showed me entering the elevator and going up shortly after 3 in the morning. It also showed me returning about 15 minutes later and going back down to my apartment. The problem was that during that entire period, no other person appeared using the elevator, the main stairwell, or the emergency exit monitored by the cameras. And yet I still remember the sound of footsteps running through the empty hallway and the noise of something heavy being dragged through apartments that, officially, weren't supposed to contain anyone at all. Story 4. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old and work as a nurse at a hospital in the Des Moines, Iowa area. A few years ago, I lived alone in a small apartment and had a pretty complicated schedule because of my shifts. Many times I left work so exhausted that I would let household chores pile up throughout the entire week. This happened on a Thursday in February of 2022. I had just finished a particularly exhausting 12-hour shift. I was exhausted, but I remembered that I needed to do laundry before the weekend because I was practically out of clean uniforms for work. The problem was that the building where I lived didn't have its own laundry facilities. I usually used a 24-hour laundromat located about 10 minutes from my apartment. I had gone there many times during the middle of the night and had never had any problems. That night, shortly after 1 in the morning, I loaded my clothes into the car and drove there. The city was practically empty. There was very little traffic on the streets and the temperature was close to freezing. When I arrived, I found the laundromat almost deserted. The place was simple. 2 rows of machines, a few folding tables, vending machines, and a small waiting area near the entrance. There were only 2 other people besides me. An older man who was finishing up unloading clothes from a dryer, and another man sitting alone near the back wall. The seated man was the one who caught my attention, not because he was doing anything obviously wrong, but because he didn't seem to be using any machine. There were no laundry baskets near him, no bags, no detergent or any other item typical of someone actually doing laundry. He simply sat there watching the activity inside the laundromat. At the time, I didn't find it particularly concerning. Some people go into laundromats during the winter to warm up or simply wait for someone. I found an empty machine, started my laundry, and began organizing my things while occasionally observing the room. The older man finished what he was doing and left a few minutes later. The seated man remained exactly where he was. For the next 40 minutes, I tried distracting myself with my phone while waiting for the wash cycle to finish. From time to time, I looked up to check on my clothes and would also glance at the man sitting in the back of the laundromat. His behavior continued to seem strange. People would occasionally come in quickly to use a machine and leave shortly afterward, but he remained in the same spot. He didn't use his phone. He didn't read anything. He didn't watch television. He simply discreetly observed who entered and who left. At one point, our eyes met for a second and he immediately looked away. That made me a little uncomfortable, but not enough to consider leaving. After all, the place was public, well lit, and had visible security cameras in several corners. When my clothes finished washing, I transferred everything to a dryer and went back to waiting. Little by little, the activity in the laundromat diminished even further. The few people still using machines began to leave. The clock was approaching 2:30 in the morning when I noticed something that made me pay closer attention to my surroundings. I was the only customer left, and the seated man was still there. That was when I began feeling genuinely uncomfortable, not because he had made any threats or comments, but because his presence no longer made sense. I had been there for over an hour and had never seen him use a single machine. I had also never seen him leave to get clothes or meet anyone. He remained seated in exactly the same chair. When I noticed that my dryer had only a few minutes remaining, I started organizing my things so I could leave quickly as soon as the cycle ended. While folding a few smaller items on the table, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. The man had finally stood up. My first thought was that he was leaving, but instead of heading directly toward the door, he slowly walked down the center aisle of the laundromat, looking around the room. Then he continued toward the exit. I felt a brief sense of relief as I watched him approach the front door. However, as soon as he stepped outside, something strange happened. The lights in the entire parking lot went out. They didn't flicker. They didn't gradually fail. They simply shut off all at once. Through the large front windows, the outside area was suddenly plunged into near total darkness. And a few seconds later, I heard the first pull on the door handle. The sound was loud enough to echo through the empty building. The front door had a mechanism that automatically kept it locked during certain overnight hours, requiring customers to use a release button to exit. I knew this because I had been using that laundromat for a long time. The problem was that the man had just walked out normally seconds earlier. I stood motionless, staring at the entrance. Then I heard the sound again. The handle was pulled hard. Then again and again. It didn't sound like someone who had forgotten how the door worked. It sounded like someone repeatedly checking whether it was actually locked. My heart immediately started racing. I moved to a position where I could partially see the parking lot without getting too close to the windows. Outside, it was extremely dark now. Only a few distant lights from the main road faintly illuminated the area. I couldn't see the man, but I continued hearing the handle being tested. At one point, the sound stopped for several seconds. The silence that followed was even worse because I had no idea where he was. I grabbed my phone and began seriously considering calling the police. While deciding what to do, I heard a different sound coming from the side of the building. It sounded like someone walking near the windows. The laundromat had large glass panels facing both the parking lot and part of the sidewall. I kept my distance and tried to observe the reflections without exposing myself directly. That's when I saw a shadow move quickly past one of the windows, then another. I couldn't tell whether it was actually a person or simply an effect of the distant lighting, but the feeling that someone was moving around outside became impossible to ignore. My clothes were still in the dryer, but at that point I no longer cared about them. I grabbed my keys, my purse, and started moving toward the employee office, which remained locked and empty overnight. As I did, I heard a light impact against the glass of the front door. It wasn't strong enough to break it, but it seemed deliberate, as if someone was trying to draw my attention to the entrance while remaining hidden in the darkness. At that moment, I decided to call the police. I knew I might be overreacting, but I would rather seem paranoid than ignore a situation that was clearly making me feel unsafe. While speaking with the dispatcher, I kept my eyes fixed on the front entrance. I explained that I was alone in a 24-hour laundromat, that a man had remained there for over an hour without using any machine, and that someone now appeared to be moving around outside trying to open the door. The dispatcher told me to stay inside the building and informed me that a patrol car would be sent to investigate. As soon as I ended the call, I heard another sound coming from outside. This time it seemed to be coming from the back of the building. The laundromat had a service door used by employees during the day. It wasn't accessible to the public, but I knew where it was located. A few seconds later, I heard a metallic noise in that direction, as though someone were testing another doorknob. My stomach dropped immediately. The possibility that there was more than one person outside crossed my mind. After all, it would have been difficult for one person to appear at both the front and back of the building in such a short span of time. I continued watching through the windows without getting too close. Then I noticed movement near my car. It was parked in one of the spaces farthest from the entrance. In the darkness, it was difficult to make out details, but I had the distinct impression of seeing a figure standing beside the vehicle. I blinked several times, trying to confirm what I was seeing. The shadow remained there for a few seconds before disappearing again. My heart began pounding. I was already mentally calculating how I would get out of there if the situation became worse. when I finally saw lights appearing in the distance. At first, I thought another customer was arriving, but I quickly recognized the unmistakable headlights of a police cruiser. As soon as the patrol car entered the parking lot, the figure near my vehicle disappeared completely. The officers entered the laundromat, listened to my account, and spent several minutes searching the area around the building. No one was found. They also never located the man who had remained seated inside the laundromat throughout the night. To them, it could have simply been a strange person wandering around the area. Maybe they were right. But before I left, one of the officers reviewed the exterior security footage. According to him, the footage clearly showed the man leaving the building. The disturbing detail was that after walking outside, he didn't go to a car or leave the parking lot. He simply remained standing in the darkness beside the building for nearly 15 minutes, watching the windows while I remained alone inside. After the officers finished checking the area, I stayed in the laundromat only long enough to collect my clothes. One of the officers remained outside while I emptied the dryer and packed everything back into my baskets. I was much more shaken than I wanted to admit. Throughout the entire process, I kept glancing toward the windows, expecting to see someone watching again from the dark parking lot. Nothing happened. When I finally left, the officers escorted me to my car and waited while I started the engine. Before leaving, I asked whether they had been able to identify the man from the cameras. The answer was no. The footage was too poor to show facial details. All they could confirm was that he truly had not used a single machine during the entire time he was there. According to the recorded timestamps, he entered about 20 minutes before I arrived and simply sat there watching the people who came and went from the laundromat. Then he left at the exact moment he realized I was the only customer remaining. For weeks I tried to convince myself that everything had simply been a strange coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he had mental health issues. Maybe he never intended to do anything. But there is one detail that still bothers me to this day. A few days after the incident, the laundromat manager showed me part of the interior security footage so that I could identify the man if he ever returned. As we watched the video, we noticed something I hadn't realized that night. At various moments when other people were present, he appeared distracted or looking at his phone. But every time someone left the laundromat, he carefully watched who remained inside. When only 2 people were left, he watched. When only 3 people were left, he watched. And when it finally came down to just him and me, he stood up immediately. Maybe that doesn't mean anything. Maybe there is a perfectly innocent explanation for that behavior. But I never returned to that laundromat during the middle of the night. Because after watching those recordings later, I got the impression that he wasn't waiting for a machine to become available. He wasn't waiting for a friend to arrive. It seemed like he was waiting for someone to be alone. Story 5. My name is Kevin. I was 27 years old when this happened, and I worked as a delivery driver for a parcel company in central Pennsylvania. My shift normally ended late, especially during busy periods when routes stretched close to midnight. I lived alone in a small rented house on a cul-de-sac in a very quiet residential neighborhood. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, and there was almost never any activity after 10 at night. This happened in early fall of 2022. I had just finished a long and exhausting workday. It had drizzled for most of the evening, but by then the weather was simply damp and cold. The streets were practically empty as I drove home. I remember thinking only about taking a shower, eating something quick, and going to sleep. There was nothing unusual about that night until the moment I turned onto my street. As soon as I rounded the corner and entered the cul-de-sac, I noticed a car parked near the end of the block. It immediately caught my attention, because there were almost never unfamiliar vehicles there at that hour. The car was parked on the opposite side of the street with all its lights off. It wasn't illegal to park there, but it seemed strange to see a vehicle in that particular spot. I continued driving normally and parked in front of my house. Before getting out, I looked through the windshield once more. The car remained exactly where it was. No headlights turned on. No doors opened. No movement was visible through the dark windows. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it belonged to a visitor at a neighbor's house or someone using their phone before continuing their drive. I grabbed my backpack, some empty containers from the passenger seat, and started unloading the last of my work items. While doing so, I continued discreetly watching the car. It remained completely motionless in the darkness. As I removed a few empty boxes from the back of my vehicle, I noticed movement coming from the direction of the parked car. The driver's door began to open slowly. It wasn't abrupt or hurried. It simply opened a few inches, then a little farther until it was fully open. I watched, expecting someone to get out. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a figure appeared beside the car. It was an adult. But the distance and darkness made identification difficult. I couldn't clearly distinguish a face, age, or clothing. What made me uncomfortable was the person's behavior. They didn't start walking. They didn't enter another house. They didn't do anything that seemed normal. They simply stood beside the open door looking toward the street. More specifically, they appeared to be looking at my house. I kept pretending to organize my things while observing discreetly. My instincts immediately began telling me that something was wrong. Maybe it was just a resident waiting for someone. Maybe it was a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few minutes, the situation became even stranger. I had already carried part of my things onto the porch and was returning for the rest when I noticed that the person was still in exactly the same position. They hadn't even closed the car door. The neighborhood was completely silent. No other vehicles passed through the street. No one was outside any of the houses. The only sound came from a sprinkler system running in a distant yard. When I picked up my backpack and prepared to finally go inside, I looked once more toward the car. That's when I had the impression that the figure had moved several yards closer. I couldn't say exactly when it happened. Maybe I simply hadn't been paying attention. But now the person appeared to be closer to the middle of the street than to the vehicle. That was enough to make me abandon any attempt at being rational. I quickly climbed the porch steps, unlocked the front door, and went inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I locked the door and spent a few seconds looking through the small side window in the living room. For the first few moments, I couldn't see much through the glass. The street lighting was weak and part of the porch blocked my view. Even so, I kept watching. That's when I heard a sound coming from outside. Footsteps, slow and steady. The noise came from the direction of the sidewalk and seemed to be approaching my house. My heart immediately began racing. I stood motionless, trying to listen more carefully. The footsteps continued for several seconds and then stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I didn't know whether the person had left, was standing in front of the house, or if I had simply misinterpreted sounds from the street. I walked to another window that offered a better view of the porch. Through the curtain, I could make out a silhouette near the beginning of the walkway leading to the front door. The person didn't seem to be trying to hide. They also didn't appear to be looking for an address. They were simply standing there, facing the house. The feeling was extremely unsettling because I still didn't understand what the person wanted. If they needed help, they could simply knock on the door. If they were looking for someone, they could call out a name. But they did neither. I picked up my phone and began considering a call to the police. While thinking about what to say, I heard a different sound coming from the porch. It sounded like the faint creak of a wooden board supporting weight. Then another. The person was climbing the steps. My stomach immediately dropped. I instinctively turned off the living room lights and stepped away from the windows. A few seconds later, I heard the clearer sound of footsteps on the porch floor. They slowly approached the front door. I could picture exactly where the person was standing at that moment, on the other side of the wood, only a few feet away. Then everything went silent again. I remained motionless for nearly an entire minute, waiting for a knock, a voice, or any kind of interaction. Nothing happened. Then I heard a very faint metallic sound. The doorknob was being tested. Not forcefully, not like someone trying to break in. It sounded more like someone carefully checking whether the door was locked. The sound happened once, then again, and then it stopped. That was the moment I decided to call the police. I knew there might be a simple explanation, but no normal situation justified someone standing in the street watching a house, walking up onto the porch, and testing the doorknob without saying a single word. While speaking to the dispatcher, I tried to stay away from the windows. I quickly explained what was happening and gave my address. She instructed me to remain inside the residence and informed me that a patrol car would be sent to check the area. As soon as I finished answering a few questions, I heard another sound from the front of the house. This time it sounded like a footstep moving across the porch. Then another. The person was no longer standing directly in front of the door. They seemed to be slowly walking across the front of the house. A few seconds later, I heard a faint noise near one of the side windows. My heart immediately began pounding. The feeling that someone was moving around the house trying to look inside was far worse than a simple attempt to open the door. I remained motionless, listening to every movement while waiting for the police to arrive. Shortly afterward, the silence returned. The sounds on the porch disappeared completely. I was still on the phone when I finally saw lights reflecting through the living room curtains. A patrol car had entered the street. I waited a few seconds until I heard an officer announcing his presence outside. When I opened the door, the officers immediately began checking the area. The car I had seen at the end of the block was still there, but it was empty. No person was found nearby. The officers searched the street, checked neighboring yards, and spoke with a few residents who were still awake. No one had seen anything. The most unsettling detail emerged when one of the officers examined the parked car. The vehicle didn't belong to any resident on the street. Furthermore, it had been left there without current registration and with no visible documents inside. It was eventually towed away several hours later. To this day, I don't know who the person standing beside it that night was, nor do I know why they decided to walk up to my porch. What still bothers me is that when the police reviewed footage from a residential security camera located a few houses away, they discovered that the individual had spent more than 20 minutes watching my house before I had even parked. The car wasn't waiting for someone in the neighborhood. At least that night, it seemed to be waiting specifically for me. Story 6. My name is Mark. I am 42 years old and work as a sales representative for a company that supplies industrial equipment. For many years, I traveled constantly to attend trade shows, conventions, and meetings in different states. Because of that, I spent hundreds of nights staying in all kinds of hotels, from major chains to small family-owned establishments located along highways. Normally, I didn't mind it. Sleeping alone in hotels was part of the routine. What happened to me took place in April of 2022 during a trip to rural Tennessee. I was attending a business convention held in a relatively small town, and the hotels closest to downtown were fully booked. I ended up reserving a room at a simple hotel located along a state highway, about 20 minutes away from the event. The place didn't seem dangerous. It was old, but reasonably well maintained. I checked in early in the evening, had dinner at a nearby restaurant, and returned to my room shortly before 10 o'clock. I was tired after driving for most of the day and fell asleep quickly. I don't know exactly how long I had been asleep before I woke up. The first thing I heard was a female voice coming from the hallway. I immediately looked at the clock beside the bed. It was 2:07 in the morning. For the first few seconds, I thought I was dreaming, but the voice continued. It sounded like a woman asking for help. Her tone was desperate and nervous. She kept repeating things like, "Please, somebody help me," and saying that someone was trying to get into her room. I sat up in bed completely awake. The voice was close enough to be heard clearly through the door. Because I traveled frequently, I had heard stories about dangerous situations in hotels, but I had never witnessed anything like this. My first reaction was to call the front desk. Before I picked up the phone, however, the woman shouted again. The voice seemed to be moving slowly through the hallway. What caught my attention was that she repeated almost the exact same phrases over and over. It didn't sound like a natural conversation or someone spontaneously asking for help. Even so, the panic in her voice was convincing enough to make me get out of bed and walk toward the door. I stood by the door trying to listen more carefully. The voice was still coming from the hallway, but there was something strange about it that I couldn't immediately identify. Maybe it was the constant repetition of the same phrases. Maybe it was the way the volume seemed to change without me being able to tell whether the person was getting closer or farther away. Either way, I stood in front of the door for several seconds without knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to open it immediately and help. Another part told me that it could be a terrible idea. I decided to look through the peephole first. I leaned toward it and took a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. The hallway was empty. There was no woman, no one asking for help, no movement at all. The only visible person was a man standing directly in front of my door, so close that he seemed to occupy almost the entire field of view through the peephole. My stomach dropped instantly. He was completely motionless. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't walking through the hallway. He appeared to be staring directly at the peephole as if he knew I was watching from the other side. I instinctively stepped back from the door. My heart began pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe the woman was somewhere else in the hallway. Maybe the man was another guest who had also come out of his room to check the situation. But then the female voice stopped completely. It didn't gradually fade away. It didn't move farther down the hall. It simply disappeared. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood motionless, staring at the door for several seconds. Then I heard a very faint metallic sound. The doorknob began to move, slowly. It didn't sound like someone trying to force the door open. It sounded like someone carefully checking whether it was unlocked. The movement happened once, then again. The handle turned until it met resistance and returned to its normal position. My entire body froze. There was no longer any doubt that the person outside was trying to access the room, and he was doing it in complete silence. Without taking my eyes off the door, I immediately grabbed the room phone and called the front desk. The line took several seconds to connect, which felt like an eternity in that moment. While waiting, I heard the doorknob being tested again. Then again. The person outside continued checking whether the door would open without making noise. When a staff member finally answered, I quickly explained what was happening. The receptionist sounded confused when I mentioned the woman asking for help in the hallway. She said they had not received any calls from guests reporting problems. Before I could respond, I heard a sound outside. It seemed like a footstep moving away from the door. Then another. I rushed back to the peephole. The man was no longer standing directly in front of my room. He was now walking slowly down the hallway toward the stairwell at the far end of the building. The receptionist informed me that she would immediately send a security employee to check the floor. I remained on the phone while watching the figure walk away. Just before he disappeared from view, he quickly turned his head toward my door. Even from a distance, I had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew I was still watching him. A few minutes later, I heard different footsteps in the hallway. This time they were faster and accompanied by the sound of a portable radio. A hotel employee arrived on the floor and knocked on my door while identifying himself. Only then did I gather the courage to open it. I explained everything that had happened, and he immediately checked the area around the rooms. No woman was found. No man either. The hallway was empty. The employee seemed genuinely concerned when I mentioned the attempt to open the door. He asked me to remain in my room while he reviewed the security cameras with the front desk. About 15 minutes later, I received a call from the hotel's night manager. She apologized for the incident and informed me that she was reviewing the footage. That's when I heard something that made me even more uncomfortable. According to her, the cameras did indeed show a man walking around the hallway near my room. The problem was that during the entire recorded period, no woman appeared in the footage. The voice that woke me up did not seem to correspond to any visible person on that floor. By that point, I had absolutely no intention of going back to sleep. I stayed awake for the rest of the night with the television on and checked every lock on the door multiple times. Around 4 in the morning, the hotel manager personally knocked on my door accompanied by a maintenance employee. They showed me part of the footage captured by the hallway cameras. The video confirmed the presence of the man. He appeared walking slowly around the floor for several minutes. At one point, he stopped directly in front of my door exactly as I had seen through the peephole. He then remained motionless for nearly a minute before testing the doorknob. The disturbing detail was that throughout the entire recording, he appeared to be alone. No woman was seen entering or leaving any rooms. No guest running through the hallway. No one asking for help. When I asked about the voice, the manager admitted she had no explanation. She also mentioned something that caught my attention. According to the hotel system, several rooms on that hallway were vacant that night. There were fewer guests on that floor than I had imagined. That meant very few people could have heard the same thing I heard. The next morning, I checked out early and continued my trip to finish my business commitments. Before leaving, I spoke with the manager again. She informed me that the local police had been contacted and that the man seen in the footage was not a registered guest. No one was able to identify him. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he was wandering through the hallways in the middle of the night. I also never discovered the source of the voice that woke me up. Maybe it came from another floor. Maybe someone was playing recordings to lure guests to open their room doors. Honestly, that last theory is the only one that makes sense to me. What still bothers me isn't the attempt to open the door. It's remembering the exact sequence of events. First, the female voice repeatedly asking for help. Then the man standing outside my room. And finally, the doorknob slowly turning on the other side of the door. Because looking back, I have the impression that someone wanted me to open the door on my own. And if I had reacted impulsively to what sounded like a desperate woman calling for help in the hallway, I probably would have done exactly that.
I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.